So I left you during the last class, last time we met, and we were talking about motivation. Now, as you're probably starting to notice, we're morphing into more of a mind, how the mind works and how learning occurs, and we're kind of shifting gears and getting into how this plays into our personalities, how this leads to longer term impacts to us as individuals, right? How does this lead into mental health, good mental health or mental health disorders, right? So we're kind of on this trajectory, and we really crossed over when we start talking about motivation, because motivation is what drives us. It gets us to do the things that we need to do to get better, to be safe and feed ourselves and grow, maybe either spiritually or career-wise or whatever, just gaining knowledge and feeling comfortable and building ourselves. We as humans are very unique in that way because we're able to make these connections that no other animal on the planet can do, right? As far as we know. At least I haven't seen any kangaroos walking around with any iPhones or anything recently, but we're ever evolving and we're doing great things to improve the quality of our life and how we exist here on the planet, right? So spinning off of motivation, we really look at how emotions form, okay? Because emotions are really an extension of our ability to communicate. And we communicate in terms of emotions too, don't we? If we're angry, we might say something a little bit more loudly, or we might be a little bit, we might be a little bit more softer if we're sad or if we're feeling happy, right? So really, our emotions come out in the way that we talk, the modality, like the volume and the pitch and the rapidness of our voice, but it also comes through our face and through our gestures and other means as well. So, and that's what we're going to talk about. Now, we're not going to talk about where emotions came from infancy on up. If you do want to hear that, take my class next semester, Psych 105, infant and early childhood development. So I do an entire week on where emotions come from. So we're really going to just talk about it from an evolutionary standpoint today. Okay. Just to kind of give you an idea where it came from in humans. All right. So all creatures really in the animal kingdom, they exhibit a certain type of behavior, but only a small portion, like I said, are what we would describe as emotions. And they are instinctive or intuitive states of mind that are symptoms of a complex cognitive function, right? No other animal that we know of does this stuff. And many of the mammals, they do display emotional states. And of course, humans are no exception to that. We can be angry. We have like our core emotions, right? Your book does a pretty good job at laying out what emotions are and the tiers, and we have variations between emotions, right? So not only angry, but we could be frustrated or we could be exasperated or whatever. I think they had that wheel on there that breaks those things out. And those are useful, right? For fine tuning what those emotions are. But at a very core level, we only have a handful of core emotions. And we know those to be anger, we know those to be joy, we know those to be depression or sadness, and we know surprise and fearful. These are all states of mind that are not always direct reflections of reason, okay? So why do we feel feelings? Where do they come from? Let me, I'm gonna share my screen with you. So I put together a slide today just because I do like to write. However, I have a lot of information I want to get to you, and this is probably the most expeditious way of doing so. All right. So why do we have feelings? If everything about our anatomy and physiology made some amount of sense in terms of evolutionary context, what would the benefit be of possessing emotions? What purpose do they serve in a sense of survival? And an analysis of emotional responses in animals really goes back all the way to Charles Darwin himself. Okay, many of you have heard about him. We've talked about it when it comes to nature versus nurture, right? He compared such responses in a variety of species and proposed that the expressions of emotion evolved in an organism as to signal to the other organism about what it's going to do next. So communication. We see communication in dogs, right? Which I'll show you here on oops, there we go. So, for example, when an animal is feeling threatened, probably our most popular example here is when they feel threatened, they might display a stance of aggression. They're going to bare their teeth. They may lead forward and make aggressive sounds. All of this behavior is to indicate to the potential of violence, oncoming violent behavior. And it does well in intimidating some percentage of other animals nearby or other individuals nearby, right? Which may then retreat in fear without necessitating an actual combat. So, thus, this type of behavior has a quantifiable impact on the survival of organisms, and therefore, it becomes preferable trait within the gene pool, right? So submission, it's really the opposite of aggression. And thus it's really expressed. If you look at the dog, picture the dog here, it's in the opposite manner physically. It has a downward posture and a version of gaze. I'm thinking donuts, uh, and other behaviors that communicate the lack of physical threat, right? They're withdrawing from that attack. And this can also serve as survival purpose in reducing the chances of confrontation, right? So both are equally important in survival. So emotional states really, they catalyze these behaviors. And it's in this context that we understand how emotions must have evolved in animals. These are very basic states. And of course, we as humans, we have a little bit more complexity to that, right? So we're going to kind of look at how this works in the brain, right? Because we're familiar with the brain. We know how learning occurs. We know how sensory motor functions occur and where localized areas of the brain where those are usually generated. But we're going to look at this in terms of the brain and different theories of that, okay? So one of the first and still relevant theories out there that attempted to explain this was the James Lange theory, and this happened right around the 1900s. And this states his theory, their theory, sorry, state that sensory stimuli are received by the cortex, which in turn activate both the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. If you remember your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system from, I think it was like chapter 2. And these responses in turn trigger an experience of an emotion in the brain. And this means that physiological state creates emotion, according to James Lange theory. Now, this really goes against everything that makes sense to us, right? Because we're all pretty smart. We all know what's going on, what's up in life, right? So many of us think that, and there's still some theories that explore this as an option, but it's opposite of common sense, which would seem to dictate that the emotion produces the physical response, right? Nevertheless, the theory really maintained that it's the autonomic activity, like change in heart rate and other involuntary responses, that trigger the emotional state. So whereas I think you've heard me use the bear as an example, right? You're walking through the woods and, of course, this is no bear that we would see in Pennsylvania, unless you're a Bigfoot fan. So whereas common sense would say that when you perceive a danger like a bear, you would feel fear, which would cause physiological reactions. Instead, James Lange theory would propose that seeing the bear would trigger a physiological reaction first and then trigger the feeling of fear. Okay. And that was a great idea. A lot of people bought into it, but along came the Cannon-Bard theory, which kind of proposed a little bit of a difference. They didn't like the fact that, or the idea that all this stuff happens in series, right? So it takes a while for us to see something and for our heart to start beating and for our sympathetic nervous system activate. It usually takes at least a couple of seconds for that to occur. And then we have to go through the mental process and say, now we're experiencing those things. That must be fear. That could take up to what they estimated up to several seconds. But Cannon-Bard theory said that doesn't work for us. So a bit later, they proposed instead that the stimuli trigger both the physical expression of emotion and the emotional state itself as kind of a parallel process. So you see the bear, you perceive the bear as a threat, and both your physiological and feeling of the fear happens simultaneously and independently, okay? However, there were several theories that came after that that suggested that neither of these models can be totally accurate, and it would seem that perception, experience of emotion, and the physical response can all really influence each other, which means a diagram similar to what you're seeing here. Okay, so they all really interact with each other, and there's an element of cognition in, according to Lazarus, right? So anyway, your book laid out a lot of really good theories of emotion. I just want to point out at this juncture that there is no right one over the other. This is still something that we're learning about today. And as I've indicated in the past, there's no way to like put electrodes in our brain to see exactly what the flow of neuronal activity is happening in there. So, the best thing that we have are these models to really go off of. All right. And who knows, maybe one of you will come up with a different theory someday when you're a doctor. So another important theory that relates more to the limbic system, right? Looking at the amygdala and the hippocampus and the cortex of cingulate gyrus. Remember all those areas, the olfactory bulb and the hypothalamus, all those areas we studied in chapter 2. This theory proposes that the emotional states are expressed when these structures act on the hypothalamus, and then they're experienced through their action on the cortex, throughout the cortex. We react. So there's almost a cognition that occurs that activates areas of the brain, which kicks in our hypothalamus and pushes endorphins and signals throughout the rest of our body, causing us to act while experiencing that fear, right? But one of the most surprising things that I think you could take away from this is that certain aspects of emotional response are consistent across not just humans all over the planet, but also other primate species. Okay. And a good example is, the facial expressions you see here, and we see the actions that follow. If animal is, we use chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are probably our closest, I think some people refer to as relatives. I'm not happy with that idea, but the closest to us anatomically and almost genetically, right? So anyway, they have very similar features that they express in the wild. They have surprise, they have disgust, they have happy and fearful, right? Very similar to what we have. So that kind of indicates to us that it's not necessarily hardwired into us, but it's recognizable across not only all humans, but some species as well. Now, there is some evidence that suggests that certain cultures may have different expressions for different situations, and that may be true, but that doesn't take away the fact that they're feeling differently. They're feeling different emotions, as opposed to, like, for example, many Asian cultures might feel upset, for example, if they get a bad grade on. I'm sorry. Reverse that here. So if somebody does well on a test, they may not experience joy in Asian cultures. That's because they're more collectivist. If their classroom does better, they'll experience joy. So that kind of explains some of the cultural differences that you may have read about or heard about. And it's just how they express it. They're still expressing joy the same way, maybe not to the level of intensity or similar facial features, but they do. It just might be the situation that's different, if that makes sense. So we do know that occurs. But it's proposed that we have 6 primary expressions that correlate with anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. All right. And that any other expression is some mixture thereof. So we may have different levels of intensity for sadness or happiness or even surprise, right? We might be a little bit surprised, or we might be really surprised. We might be a little bit surprised and disgusted at the same time, right? I can use an example. When I moved up here for this job, I was both sad and happy at the same time. I was happy to be working at ESU University. East Stroudsburg University, but I was a little bit sad that I had to move. So we can experience a mix of emotions at any given time, right? And that happens often. And I'm sure many of you can probably relate to that. So facial feedback hypothesis. So Facial feedback hypothesis proposes that simply enacting a particular facial expression can influence the onset of a corresponding emotion. And there exists some evidence to support this. There's a very popular task, a popular experiment that's been done probably in many, many classes. I actually use this in my live classes as well. If we had a little bit more time today, I would run it with this class, but 50 minutes is not a lot of time. But what I have the students do, I have half the students take a pencil or a pen and put it in their teeth. And then I have the other half the students take a pencil or pen and put it above their lip between their nose, kind of making a frowny face and holding it there. Okay. So the people with the pencil in their teeth and the ones with the pencil above their nose, below their nose. So then I put up on the screen a comic strip. And it's not a very good comic strip. It's not anything that's going to make everybody bust out laughing, but there's some humor to it. And they look at the comic strip, and then I ask every one of them to rate on scale 1 to 10 how funny they think that comic strip is. So the two groups that I had within that classroom are people that had the pencil between their teeth and one that had it above their lip. Which of the groups do you think said that? On average, said that comic strip was more funny? What do you think?
The one on the lips?
The one in the teeth, believe it or not. Because the one in the teeth, as we know, again, according to facial feedback, is we're smiling, right? They're emulating smiling when they're putting it in their teeth. And that's telling our brain, yeah, we might be smiling. Something might be funny or happy here. So there's kind of an exchange in there. And I'm not saying just because we're smiling makes us happy, right? In fact, that could be some very dangerous thought, especially when we get into mental health disorders, right? Because putting on a false face, while it does help in certain situations, long term, it could lead to very, very bad things. It could lead to compartmentalization and stuffing and bottling of emotions, which is not a good thing, right? So again, our facial feedback is telling our brain that we're either happy, or if it's above their lip, it's emulating a frown. So the people with it in their teeth actually rated the cartoons higher, and this has been funnier. And this has been replicated across lots of classes and lots of populations. But yeah, that kind of demonstrates the facial feedback. All right. All right. When it comes to studies of emotion, most research focuses on fear. And this is the emotional reaction to any kind of immediate threat. Okay. It's the easiest emotion to study because it's simple to infer from behavior of many species, right, including humans. Fear tends to produce either defensive behaviors meant to protect the person or the organism from harm, or aggressive behaviors meant to threaten or harm the threat itself. These are instinctual behaviors that have evolved for survival purposes, and they take on a variety of forms in different mammalian species, including humans, though they often obey a target site concept, which is this. This means that the behaviors are meant to attack specific places on threatening organism while protecting certain vulnerable areas of itself. Now, and when we get into stress, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but why do you think we shrug our shoulders when we're fearful? When our fear responses, why do we shrug our shoulders, do you feel? Why is that one of our muscle tension?
Protects your neck.
Protect our neck, right? We have a lot of vital, life-saving functions and signals that are going through our neck up to our brain, and our brain down to our body, right? So we know this. We know that if we lose our head in battle, game over, right? Player zero, 0 players left. So we know that, and that's one of the reasons that we hypothesize, according to evolutionary psychology, why that's part of a repertoire of skills, is to protect our neck, right? So aggressive, speaking of aggressive behavior, so they can be predatory, they can be for eating, or social, as to establish and maintain social hierarchy. Typically, we see this among males, and hence the so-called alpha male that exists in communities of certain animals, right? We see that in dogs, most prominently in dogs. Anybody that has a dog, you know that there is a certain order within the household that they need to establish. It can be argued we see that with humans, right? Might be a little bit of alpha male in some people. I'd like to think we're higher evolved in that, but I think evidence suggests otherwise sometimes. Just watch the news. We also see defensive behaviors that are a little bit more varied. They can be intraspecific, defending against social aggression, for example. Freezing and flight, which involves staying perfectly perfectly still when a threat is perceived until like a safety zone has been violated, and at which point they'll attempt to flee rapidly, or in some cases maybe even defend, right? So freezing can happen in both, in trying to establish. And I think the most popular they use here is a deer, right? Unless you're in Poconos where they're fearless and they'll headbutt your car if they want to. But for the most part, deer anywhere else, and that's really common just to Poconos. I've been all over the world, really, and I can't tell you, just my encounters with deer here, it's just crazy. I've never seen them so fearless before. Everywhere else, if you're within 100 feet of them, they're gone. You'll never see them again. But for some reason, they just love hanging around and greeting people around here, right? So anyway, animals that engage in risk assessment. Now think about this as I'm saying it, right? We scan, I'm going to say because we're showing chipmunks and I think that's a gopher there, scanning their environment defensively. And then some have burrowing into the ground or hiding, right? What does that emulate? If you think of somebody that is experiencing a high degree of stress or perceiving a threat, what do you think they do in the morning? Is it a little harder for them to get up in the morning? Probably, right? That we can see that as avoidant behavior or hiding, right? Similar to what some animals do when they're defensive, right? And of course, lastly, we have the maternal defense behaviors where a mother will instinctively protect their young at times in such a violent manner that it really resembles male aggression. Okay. All right. We have social aggression, which we talked about. Is in most species, it's exhibited very prominently in males, typically much more than in females, with the exception of aggression associated with protecting their young. And this is really because of a period in which testosterone is released in males around birth. Seems to have an effect on the organization of the nervous system, which is then reinforced by further testosterone right around the time of puberty for the male. Okay. And if anybody, and I'm sure everybody in this class has gone through puberty, so puberty is a time when hormones are just all over the place, right? They make us cry, they make us laugh, they make us slam doors and throw things when we don't normally do that. That's evidence that testosterone really plays a big part in social aggression. You see the rough and tumble. You see probably a little bit more fist fights in right around the 11, 12, 13-year-olds. So anyway, there's really the correlation between testosterone and aggression is really still being studied and is far from conclusive. We see them in animals. We see that there's a very certain hierarchy in animals, but in humans, it varies. Not everybody shows social aggression, and that may be some sort of phasing out of that evolutionary gene, that necessity to do that. We do see that we're able to think before we act, right? Because our innate desire, like if you imagine somebody cutting us off with a car, our innate desire is to get out and probably beat the pulp out of them or flip them the bird or shout something at them, right? But we know as a social creature, as a social species, we know that that would not serve us well, and we're able to put things into place. So there's a lot of studies that are going into understanding why humans have a little bit more control. I mean, we know we do. We know we have higher cognition and higher morals and judgment than most any other animals. I don't necessarily see. I think I said before, I don't see kangaroos hanging around with iPhones. So we are a little bit more evolved in that aspect. Not by much, right? I'm joking. From our understanding of fear, it's at a very mechanical level, and it's quite a little bit more sound, because we really see fear in animals more prominent than anything any other emotion, right? We see it physiologically, but anyway, one of the experiments that we used was conditioning rats. If you remember, I think it was chapter 4 or 5, when we were learning about learning, classical conditioning, right? So we did this with rats to induce fear based on a bell. And how we did that is producing a sound, a tone, right before an animal received an electric shock. And eventually, that rat was able to respond to the tone itself without the actual shock. Very similar to what we learned with classical conditioning and Pavlov's dog, right? So why does it work this way? Why are we able to produce fear when things don't actually cause it? And we're going to talk much more about that when we get into rational and irrational fears, when we get into mental health disorders, I think in week 13, I believe, right? But from a physiological standpoint, we can see that the neural mechanisms that produce these responses, they can be mapped through studies involving lesions in the auditory pathways, or even in the amygdala. So taking away their hearing would eliminate that fear response, because they can't hear it. But also putting lesions in the brain with the amygdala, which is the center for that fight or flight. So this makes sense in the context of us understanding the amygdala, but what purpose would that serve? I mean, what do you think the survivability would be of an individual, an organism that has no fear? There are people that walk around with less fear, or they don't experience any fear because they might have something dysfunctional with their amygdala. What do you think the harm would be in that? What would be the danger of somebody not feeling fear?
I've actually heard about people like that, and it's scary. They're not afraid of jumping over a tree, or they're not afraid of anything, and that's very bad for their survival rate.
Yeah, it affects their survival rate. Exactly. And I reflect on every time I talk about this, it brings up, I don't know if this is still a thing in high school, but if your buddies, usually some kind of semi-bully, they weren't really a bully, but they were like the bully of your little group, tried to shock you, like either pretend to punch you in the face or something. And if you flinched, they got to tag you in the arm pretty hard. So it got me all the time with that. So my fear response is through the freaking roof. Right. So I'm easily startled, but I'm also quick to react. All right. And that kind of exemplifies what we're talking about here. And Krasimir, what you're talking about is when somebody doesn't have that fear, their lifespan tends to be a lot shorter because they don't respond in a survivalistic way to that fear. So fear is definitely, while it'd be great if we didn't have any fear to anything, we probably wouldn't recognize something dangerous and react accordingly. Okay. All right. So I'm going to kind of just skip through a couple of those slides here. So from the standpoint of cognitive neuroscience, there's really a lot of work that needs to be done surrounding the brain mechanisms of human emotion. We're just really scratching the surface of what we know. I know we've been at it for well over 100 years, but we're still learning something a little bit every day as far as how human emotion works and the interaction with brain function. Okay. And it appears that brain activity associated with each individual emotion is not highly localized, but rather diffuse. So we don't have one specific area of our brain that controls happiness and another, like we said with amygdala. Now we know the amygdala does activate, right? And it's important that it does. We see it light up on our functional MRIs when fear responses are warranted, but the cognition or the understanding of fear happens throughout our brain, even in the frontal cortex. Okay. And regulation of our behaviors really happens throughout our brain too. So there's really no localized area where that occurs. Each emotion or even the experience of empathy when observing emotional states of others is accompanied by activity in the motor cortex and sensory cortex. So what do I mean by that? Brain imaging really shows a similar pattern of brain activity that are enacted when a person experiences an emotion, imagines an emotion, or even observes somebody else that's experiencing that emotion. So if we see somebody, that's saying if we see somebody else that is happy, that affects us, right? That affects us in a way almost as if we're happy ourselves, as if we're smiling ourselves. We see similar brain activity compared to the person that if they were actually smiling themselves, if that makes sense. So some really cool groundbreaking stuff related to emotions. Okay. All right, so let's finish off with talking about stress, right? Something we've all experienced this week, especially. When the body is exposed to excessive harm or threat of harm, this initiates a physiological change known as a stress response. Activation, if you remember from chapter 2, the activation of our sympathetic nervous system, right? These are adaptive changes in response to the stressor that are beneficial in the short term, but eventually have adverse effect on an organism. And I'll describe that here in just a little bit. Now, your book, you talked about HPA axis, and I'm not going to go really too much into this, except all you really need to know is that the sympathetic nervous system that's involved releases epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla, releases that into the blood vessel, which activates the heart rate, converts higher concentrates of within the liver to glucose, decreases digestive processes, and decreases also dilation of your lungs. Okay, increases blood pressure, all those fun things. And that sounds horrible. It sounds like a really rough thing, but it's a very necessary thing. And small doses of this is not a bad thing. It actually improves our immune system. It boosts our immune system in a short way. But anyway, this is the two system view of stress response, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and the sympathetic nervous system activating together. Okay. All right. So stress responses, they're complex and they really vary from person to person. So what one person would respond to a certain stimuli or situation would be different from another. Okay. They can come from various sources. They can come from jobs, they can come from relationships, or even social obligations, right? They can have effect similar to physical stressors. Now, let me ask you, how many of you experience test anxiety? I know I do. I experience test anxiety. I have to take my counselor's exam. That really weighs on me. That I have to do that because there's so much that we put on the line for that. So why is it we experience a similar stress to doing presentations or getting up in front of a crowd as we would to a bear in the woods that could actually cause us harm? What's the correlation? Why does it work that way? One study, or several studies actually, have shown that social evaluative threat, especially when we're talking about social anxiety, it represents a context in which the self could be judged negatively by others. And if you kind of think about your own situation, many of us don't like to get up in front of people. It's because we're social beings. We value what other people think about us. And if we come up in front of a group of people and we feel like we're inept, that could reflect negatively on us and our social status. So that's where that fear comes from. It's almost a fear of isolation, if you will. All right. So where was I? Excessive amounts of stress, okay, can result in certain disorders. Again, chronic. We're looking at chronic, like short doses of stress, like school. Many of you are probably experiencing a high level of stress because of the level of work that you have due every week. That's temporary, right? Hopefully for many of you, but that's very temporary. And at the end of the semester, many of you will probably be some of you might be graduating, others might be going on to do further studies at the university, and you're going to go through that stress cycle again. However, it's very temporary, right? It's not long-term. It shouldn't be long-term and enduring. Anyway, it can result in disorders such as gastric ulcers, heart disease, high blood pressure, you name it. Okay. Stress can have an impact on the immune function as well. And brief stressors, they actually improve the immune function, and chronic stressors can really deplete the immune function over long periods of time, which leaves us open to other diseases and viral infections and disorders. The mechanism that really impacts the immune function is not really widely known. We're still kind of working on it. We do know that T cells and B cells have receptors that interact during the sympathetic nervous system when that's activated. So we do know that there is interaction in there. We don't know exactly why. It's a great field for many of you if you want to get into it and understand why the immune system functions the way it does, because it impacts our physical health, right? So many of you that are becoming doctors, you can't just separate psychology and biology because they're really mixed into one for people, for individuals, right? All right. So in regards to stress, your takeaway here today, and this kind of leads me into further discussions when we get into mental health disorders, is how we manage our stress. What are some strategies? I'm going to throw this out to the class here. What are some strategies you have for reducing your I mean, we're all exposed to stress. What are some ways that you reduce your stress?
I listen to music.
Okay, listen to music. That's a good way. All right.
Increase physical activities.
Okay, physical. So kind of getting your body ramped up so you can relax a little bit later. That's a good strategy.
I meditate.
Meditate. Okay. That's another good way. Anybody else?
Going on walks.
Going on walks. Okay, so kind of like exercising, right?
Yeah.
So there are a lot of strategies you can use, and yes, going on walks is great. One of the things I work with my patients and clients on, and even children, I mean, this is helpful for children, is anybody that's experiencing a high level of stress, I have them go through a breathing exercise. I'm kind of running up on time. I don't have a lot of time to do that today, but breathing exercises and muscle relaxation. Teaching them this method helps with temporary periods of anxiety and even episodes of panic even. So panic disorder or features of panic really emulate like serious heart attacks. Some people believe they're actually having heart attacks and they're dying. They might hyperventilate. They might pass out even. So one of the ways that we can't really control a lot of those sympathetic nervous responses, nervous system responses that we have, like our heart rate, that happens, our temperature goes up, our pupils dilate, we become hyper aware, our attention becomes hyper aware, our muscles start tensing up, right? Remember we talked about our neck and our shoulders. Our breathing becomes we require more oxygen, but we're not breathing nearly as much. In fact, in some cases, when we're in freeze mode, we stop breathing altogether. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. Some people believe that we're trying to breathe more. We do need to breathe more, but it gets to the point where we're not breathing at all, and that leads people into hyperventilating. So that's where the misconception is, that we actually breathe more when we're stressed. We breathe less. We're trying to, because we can't breathe and listen for threats at the same time. So anyway, one of the things I like to work with people on is going off of, we learned about the James Lange theory and how our physiological symptoms can kind of get back in line with our minds, right? So if we're worked up physiologically, then our mind is going to continue thinking that we're stressed, and it's going to think that we're still under a threat. And that's going to, again, feed continuation of those nervous system responses. So one of the ways that I help my clients is teaching them breathing exercises, and it's very simple. I have them take a duration of 3 seconds and breathe in through their nose and hold it for 2 or 3 seconds. Deep breath, like fill up their chest and their belly, and then breathe out for 3 seconds. Okay. And I have them do that while they're sitting with me and they're practicing this. And what that's doing is that's telling your lungs that everything's normal, everything's fine, we're breathing normally. And what the counting does is it distracts them from whatever they're fixated on, whatever threat or whatever thought is going on in their mind. So if there's no real threat around them and it's perceived irrational threat, then it's distracting their mind. So I don't know if you knew this, but you can't do a high functioning task, cognitive task, and fixate on something worrisome at the same time, right? You can't do that. So what you're doing is you're distracting your mind by counting. You're also getting air into your lungs, and which is vital for your brain to function. And you're tricking your mind into saying everything's cool here. Another thing I work with people on, because again, we don't have a lot of control over our autonomic nervous system. So what they can do is they can release tension in their necks and their shoulders. So while they're with me and they're breathing, I have them rotate their neck and I have them release their shoulders. Just pay attention to not doing this. So releasing their shoulders. And it's very important they do that because, again, you're tricking your mind into your body into telling your mind that everything's cool, everything's fine, everything's calm. So really powerful stuff. And I don't know, maybe some of you can relate to this. If you're enduring a lot of stress, you might have tension headaches, right? And that comes from locking up your muscles in the back of your neck. And that's pinching nerves within the base of your spine and restricting even blood flow to your brain, which causes tension headaches for some people. So again, rotating your neck is super helpful. So hopefully these are things that you can employ if say you're just experiencing a stressful situation or you're watching the news or something and you just want to relax. Take 10 minutes, turn off the news and just kind of relax your body, focus on taking long breaths and paying attention to where you're carrying that tension. Okay. All right. Does anybody have anything to add, or does anybody have any questions before we depart today?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Was